2.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Food for Thought seminar for July. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to remind you all that we're still welcoming suggestions for the Food for Thought speakers for later this year. So please drop us an email if you have any suggestions at foodforthought@food.gov.uk. Today's speaker is Dr. Megan Blake. She joined Sheffield University in 2000 and is a recognised expert in food security and food justice. She has an established international reputation for her research focusing on 3 intersecting strands. 1, the surplus food chains and practices of redistribution. 2, the community organisations, social innovation and self-organisation and practices of resilience. And 3, social inequalities. She is the creator of Food Ladders, which is a multi-scaled and asset-based approach that uses food to increase everyday food security, connect communities, and increase local resilience by reducing vulnerability. Her film, More Than Just Food, illustrates the ways in which community-based food ladders can change places. You can find her on Twitter at geofood.org or geofoodie.org, or on her personal website at www.geofoodie.org. So before I hand over, a few housekeeping notes. As this is a live event, your microphone is muted, so you won't be able to speak directly to Dr. Blake. If you do have any questions, please type them into the chat bar on the right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to post any questions whenever you like, but do note we will not cover these until the end of the talk, when I will read them out for Dr. Blake to answer. Finally, to note that this seminar is being recorded. From all of us at Food for Thought, we hope you enjoy, and I will now pass you over to Dr. Blake, who will begin her presentation.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about my research. So the title of the talk today is Understanding Food Insecurity in the United Kingdom. We tend to think of developed countries like the United Kingdom, or wealthy countries like the United Kingdom, as not having food security, or food insecurity, but in fact it does, and it's increasing. So with further ado, I'll just kind of launch into that. One of the things I want to do today is really bring in some of the Food in U2 Wave 3 data, and I've done a little bit of this work. So the experience of food insecurity, firstly, is a continuum. It's not a discrete set of pots that people experience, they jump into and then jump out to. Actually, they move through different levels of insecurity at different times of the month or at different times of the year. The experience in today, we tend to focus those in the very orangest aspects, but overlook those who are vulnerable. And in fact, it's really easy to become food insecure if you're vulnerable, and it is easy to slide into vulnerability if you're at the trailing edge of being food secure. And just to illustrate this, drawing on the Food in U2 Wave 3 data, please remember that we reviewed these statistics. This was prior to the cost of living crisis and the withdrawal of the £20 a week UC uplift in the autumn. What we are seeing is, and what's quite likely, is that things are actually getting much worse. In the most deprived localities, 2 out of every 3 people were either food insecure or vulnerable to food insecurity in the spring of 2021. Also, drawing on your data, if you separate the analysis between urban and rural areas, the index of multiple deprivation is pretty good if you're looking just at urban areas. It's a pretty good indicator, although it's not perfect. So there's still a presence of experience of vulnerability to food insecurity in those areas that are of very low deprivation. In those places, that nearly 1 in every 14 adults is food insecure, with a further 1 in every 16 who is vulnerable to food insecurity. So this is urban places. However, IMD, or Index of Multiple Deprivation, is not a particularly good predictor of vulnerability to food insecurity for those who are living in rural localities. For the most deprived, vulnerability doubles from urban areas to about 45% of adults, while actual food insecurity is less in these areas. But in those areas that are least deprived, 1 in 6 adults is vulnerable to food insecurity. These rates are higher than for those living in IMD areas, quintile areas 2 to 4. We also know that those who are disabled, and particularly the severely disabled, are significantly likely to be food insecure. For the severely disabled, this is a factor of about 20 compared to the non-disabled. And those with 3 or more children, compared to those without, are also significantly more likely to be food insecure. We're also sitting in a context where we largely focus on the most insecure, well, in terms of our support, while ignoring those who are living within hidden hunger or who are vulnerable. This is increasing health inequalities, as I'll argue later on in this talk, and creating a further crisis of mental health issues. I was on BBC Moneybox Live yesterday talking about food insecurity, and there are stories from the front line that absolutely indicate and illustrate that in the last months the situation has gotten much worse than it predicted in this data or depicted in this data. We are sleepwalking toward a food security crisis if we are not there already. Inflation and energy bills are impossible now for so many, but the winter will be horrible. Parents turn the heat on to keep their children warm, and we know this. People at food banks right now are asking for barbecues and food that does not have to be cooked in order to avoid turning on the electricity. People are turning off their refrigeration because they cannot afford the cost of running them, which of course has implications for preserving food chain and food safety. People are eating frozen pizza raw. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So what is the problem? What needs to change so that people can enjoy the food that sustains their lives and their health and their well-being? And that's what I'm going to talk about today in this research. So I'm going to highlight a little bit the research approach. I'm going to talk about food insecurity as a system because that's how I approach it. I'll talk a little bit about the UK context and why local scale resilience building matters by focusing in particular on the food ladders research that I did. And I want to really emphasize here what sort of mid-tier, what I call mid-tier support looks like. So just to give you the key highlights or takeaways before we get started, while I started this discussion about food affordability, I want to stress that food insecurity is a system and is more than just financial. As such, it needs solutions that are not linear or single interventions responses, but instead joined up thinking and multiple interventions. The beauty of a systems approach is that while we all have a role to play, and it isn't just someone else's or some other department's responsibility. Food insecurity has effects. These effects settle onto people and into landscapes, and I'll illustrate that with some research that I've done during the COVID period. And then to solve the problem, we need to not just give people money or give people food, but we must also repair these effects as well as address the causes. This involves transitioning people and places so they're less vulnerable to risk by building ladders of support. So the methods, this research is a sort of 10 years worth of research with community organizations and food provision organizations. That are offering and integrating in places. It's interdisciplinary. It works with people who are struggling. I've spent a lot of time with local authorities thinking about how they're approaching food plans. I've worked with national charities and national scale food alliances, think tanks, and so forth. The methods that I've used have been participant observation, interviews, workshops, surveys, and national data sets. I've examined food practices in charities. I've done SWOT analysis of local authority charity partnerships, really trying to understand self-organizing capacity within communities and how people talk about themselves, food, and their communities. So let me just talk a bit and step back to this notion of what food insecurity is and thinking about it as a system. So the Food and Agricultural Association, or the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN identifies 4 pillars of food insecurity. And typically these 4 pillars are constructed around national scale food security, but they apply also really well to household food insecurity. So the one that we really notice or really focus on, particularly in wealthy contexts, is this notion of access. Can I afford the food that my family needs to live an active and healthy life? Do I have friends and family who I will be able to turn to should I need it? So that's that sort of access. Can I access food if it's available in the place where I live? The availability is also a key component. So the question then is there safe, healthy food in the place where I live that meets my needs? And when we think about food deserts, those spaces where food is not available in the place, that good food that people need, there may be an absence of a commercial outlet that provides it, or there may be an absence of some other community support, then people's availability in the place where they are is lacking. Their food security is threatened. And of course, if we are going to live in a socially just society, having food in the place where they live is really important. We're adding a penalty or a premium onto people who have to travel further. Quite often, it's places where people are already struggling, and then the added extra burden of having to travel long distances to get the food that they need means that they forego that food and opt for options that are maybe less healthy but are locally available. And if you think about it, if it costs you £5 to travel on the bus to a place that serves fruits and vegetables, or that offers fruits and vegetables, but the fruits and vegetables, are less than that, your food budget is also being stretched hugely in this situation, but it also means that the cost of getting it is a disincentive, and plus then we have time costs as well. And if people's lives are already constrained and stretched, it's going to be really difficult to actually give this extra time. There's also this issue of utilization. So often we think of utilization as being about food safety, and in the UN documentation and in the discussions at national scale, we talk about, is food safe? Is it stored safely? Is the cold chain preserved, and so forth? But when we think about utilization at the household scale, we also need to be thinking about skills and bodily ability. Can I physically do the task? Do I have arthritis? And is it impossible for me to unscrew that lid? How do I cook it? Do I know how to cook it? Do I have the mental headspace in order to be able to plan and organize and strategize how I will compile and make meals that meet my family's needs? And am I motivated to eat well? So when we think about elderly people, or elderly isn't the right word, older people who are older, who live alone at home, are at severe risk of malnutrition. And part of that is because they are alone and they're eating alone. And the motivation to eat and to cook meals that are healthy is severely reduced. There's a fantastic organization in Scotland called Food Train that really seeks to address this issue, and I would encourage you to have a look at them. Of course, these elements then are linked to time. So are all these things stable? Do I have them all of the time? And we know from the data and from talking to people that at the beginning of the month, people may have enough money to stretch to be able to meet their food needs, but by the end of the month, they may not. Or by the beginning of the month, they may be able to travel a further distance, but at the end of the month, they may not. So it is something that varies for people over time. If you're thinking about people with illnesses or with disabilities, people may have a disability, but they may have good days and bad days. So on the good days, they can stand at the cooker and cook, or they can unscrew that lid, but on a bad day, they may not. So stability is also a key component. Now, of course, while the UN describes these as pillars, they're actually really more of an overlapping set or a system. All of these things must be present for people all of the time in order for people to be food secure. So that is the approach that I'm taking. And we can also see that if we think about it this way, food insecurity then is not just about poverty. Poverty is a big component because it feeds into those access issues. It informs that kind of availability component. It also may inform utilization, which I'll talk about in a minute. But sorry, I've lost my train of thought. But poverty is bigger than food insecurity, just as food insecurity is bigger than just poverty. So, for example, people may have the money to be able to afford the food that they need, but it's not available and they cannot physically get to that place in order to access it. So we are seeing, and we do see people who are food insecure, who have the money that they need to be able to buy the food, but they're also, so they're not living in poverty as we might, as the previous research, or the focus might suggest, actually these other elements are also contributing to their struggle. So I said that food insecurity sediments into landscapes and it settles onto people. And I want to kind of really talk about this a little bit. So in places where there's a cumulative loss of foodways, as people's knowledge and understanding about food narrows, because they are avoiding those risky foods that might go off quickly. They're avoiding foods that they've not tried before, because you don't want to try something new if your family isn't going to like it, if it's going to start a fight and so forth. That kind of risky, people become more and more risk adverse. They also become risk adverse around food safety issues. So while people understand in theory, they understand the use by and sell by dates, or the best before dates and the use by dates, they often conflate the two in their daily practices because they worry about becoming ill. If you become ill, you cannot then go do that job that you've got, and your income is decreased. What that means in the places where there are lots of people living like this, food knowledges disappear and there's a loss of foodways. There's also a loss of that food then in those places, because it's no longer commercially viable to sell those sort of what we might not think is exotic, but in those places are more exotic foods, things like grapes and parsnips. We also see that there's a loss of local support networks. Somebody said to me one time, if people don't have money for food, they've not got money to socialize. Socializing is a key aspect of human existence. Being able to be reciprocal, to buy presents, to express love through gifts and so forth, to socialize with your friends is really, really important. And we know from scientific data that people with strong social networks live better longer, even if they have illnesses, even if they have long-term disability or illnesses. And that loss of those networks is really harmful in these places. And what that means then is that these places become less resilient. People don't know each other, they begin to fear each other, there's a greater fear of crime. We know that in places where people are hungry, there's some acting out that happens, and there's increased sort of fragmentation in these places. So when that happens, people become more vulnerable because they're more isolated, and they're more vulnerable not just to food insecurity, but also more vulnerable to the other risks, such as crime and loss of property and inability to cope when other things happen. As I mentioned already, we see the foodscapes, the landscapes within which people source and acquire their food or utilize their food. We see a degradation of these foodscapes. That healthy food disappears from those landscapes, which then provides limited access to healthy food options. So even if people wanted to try to reincorporate that food into their lives, it's just not existing in those spaces. During the pandemic, I did a piece of research with a PhD student here at the university called Nicole Kennard. And we did a bunch of interviews with people who were getting support from a local food organization who was doing food delivery during that time. And we listened to their stories, and they talked about being absolutely stretched. They talk about being stressed, and they talk about struggle. And I want to make just a really short and important point here. People who are living within food insecurity or who are in food insecure do not talk about themselves as living in poverty. They talk about themselves as struggling. Poverty language, the food poverty language, is not relatable for these folk. Instead, if you use language like struggling, people who are struggling, it's much more relatable. We can all relate to having a struggle at some point in our life. So Diane, I just want to highlight Diane, who is, she is a survivor of domestic abuse, and she moved into a women's shelter just before lockdown in March 2020. She was unable to leave the shelter because she had a health problem as well, and it required her to have a medical procedure, which meant that she had to self-isolate. she described that the only way that she had to get food was by the local shops where she lived and to use volunteers to do that shopping for her. Now, previously, she'd gone to a discount supermarket where her money stretched far enough that she could get, quite a range of things. She was managing okay. But having to move from, given where she lived, to volunteers who would only go to the local shop, she said that her food bill cost her 3 times more. And this plummeted her into a budget situation, which meant that she was unable to make her money stretch throughout the whole of the month. So this isn't that she doesn't have enough money. This is really an issue of she had enough money, but the context meant that that financial resource wasn't sufficient. So yes, she didn't have enough money in that context, but with it involves or engages a changing context. This, of course, also illustrates the isolation that she was experienced, resulting to have spend more on food. She did not have friends or family because she was in she'd escaped an abusive relationship and had to move away. So her friends and family couldn't pick up things for her. So she didn't have those social networks. She also said that this not only, isolation was making it so she didn't see people, but it had a really severe effect on her sense of well-being and self-worth. And this translated into how she felt about herself, but how she engaged with others. She talked about how she used to be a social butterfly, but now she's not. She feels isolated and alone and lonely. So to address food insecurity, we must also repair the foodscapes within which people live, and we should not expect people to have to travel long distances to access that food. We also should expect or should include, when we think about how we're supporting people, not only just about that financial aspect or those place-based elements such as is there food here, but also consider how this is affecting on their physical and mental ability, and how their physical and mental situation is also reinforcing and reproducing food insecurity. So I want to just, before I kind of talk about that mental stuff just a little bit more and those connections, I want to talk a little bit about the maps that we produced last summer. So last summer, my colleagues Angelo Moretti, Adam Whitworth, and I created a map at local authority scale, drawing on data from the Food Foundation survey that was conducted in January of 2021. It's a similar sample to the Food and You 2 survey, and what we did is we used direct estimates, which came from this survey, and then indirect estimates in order to be able to make sample sizes big enough to provide this level of indication at local authority scale. And this map has actually proven to be really useful. People often don't think of local authority scale as being particularly useful, and certainly local authorities want it at smaller scale. But what it really highlighted is the place at which politics happens. So the place where there are political levers. So it made, the result of this map is it made certain areas who only saw around them the wealth, so for example, High Wycombe, only saw around them wealth and didn't recognize what was going on in that place where they lived. It also really meant that local authorities could use the map to indicate what sorts of interventions might be needed in those places. So there's a link to the map, and it's right there for you, and I'm happy to share it, where you can go and play. It's an interactive map. You can go and play around with it, put the different levels on, click on the different elements of it. You can also see, really, we used measures called struggle and worry, and then there's another one that just pulls out those who said they were hungry. So what we can see is actually there's huge variation, and the regional level data hides this huge variation. When you look at sort of even local authority scale, you can begin to see that within a region, like for example, let's use Yorkshire. Within Yorkshire, places like Harrogate and York tend to hide, or some of even North Yorkshire, hide and obscure those pockets of difficulty that are being experienced even within that same region. So this is the map for struggle. We also had another one about worry, and these were places where people were in that sort of vulnerability stage. And I wanted to include worry because it's not, and what I'll talk about is worry matters. Worry, when you are worried, there's a high level of stress that you're introducing to your everyday life. And it's not just casual worry. I'm talking about consistent, persistent worry about how will I make it? That worry about will I or do I wake up in the middle of the night pondering and ruminating over how am I going to manage? And of course, that's a clear indication of depression. And it means that then when you go to work the next day, it's much, much harder, you know, because you're lacking in sleep, and burnout happens so much more quickly. That worry is a real and important, we shouldn't be ignoring that worry and that vulnerability because it's endemic. And actually, it's the biggest category across the United Kingdom of people. There are lots of people in this bucket. All right. So there is a very little overlap in our map because of the way it was calculated between those who are worried and the struggling group. So you can kind of see, but when you overlay one map on top of the other, and have I done this? When you overlay them, you can see that in some areas there's an awful lot of struggle, and in some areas there's an awful lot of worry, and in some areas there is an awful lot of worry and struggle. So, for example, Kirklees is this sort of area, and I've just used the north of England here, but there are areas like this across the whole of the UK. So I include this because I want to really hammer home the notion that food insecurity is geographical. It is absolutely place-based, and places have a role in shaping how we approach and how we produce ladders or introduce ladders of support in places will make a very big difference to how well people can and will get on. And I really encourage that the FSA, and I have had conversations with some of you about how we might use or expand Food in You to provide local authority scale data. Now, one of the limitations, of course, is the sample size in the survey. 6,000 people isn't quite enough to really make super robust indicators at local authority scale. If there's any way of making it any bigger, that would be fantastic. As I already mentioned, the map resonates and at the scale of politics. MPs and local authorities absolutely took note and were shocked and were inspired to see that actually there might be something they can do in their localities to make a difference. And I'd also really like to see local authority monitoring through surveys. So if there is some way that we can find and support local authorities to be able to monitor their local food insecurity, and like we do when we monitor school attendance, that would be really fantastic as well. We can do this analysis, as we've done, if there is at least one data point in each unit of analysis. So at least one data point in each local authority, but more would certainly be better. Okay, so I mentioned physical and mental health as having links, and I hope I've begun to really illustrate that. So I mentioned already that over 10% of the over 65s are malnourished or at risk of malnutrition, according to Age UK. And they estimate that this is a cost of about 20 billion per year to the government. The sort of issues of being able to, or malnutrition is more prevalent in those with long-term health conditions, such as dysphagia, which is problems with swallowing, with those who are socially isolated and have limited mobility or on low income, and those who are recovering from a serious injury, such as cystic fibrosis or tremors. Eating according to the Eat Well Guide can address this issue or these issues, but yet it's unaffordable for those who earn less than £15,800 a year. And there are an awful lot of children who live in these households. It's particularly difficult also for those who live in food deserts. And of course, narrow diets that I mentioned already contribute to malnutrition. If you are food insecure, it also becomes difficult to participate in social activity, which includes socializing, but also practicing social values, because it is literally and figuratively out of your reach. So according to Danny Miller, thrift is a key British value, and I have met so many people who are food insecure, who are practicing amazing thrift acrobatics, keeping track of the cost of various products across a range of stores so they know when and where the bargains are to be had. They manage household budgets that do not stretch far enough, and they walk miles because they know the cost of the transportation will mean that there will be less food for them to eat. The transportation cost is also part of the food budget. Not only does this combination of being made to feel like a failure, people are trying super hard, it also creates a really heavy mental load. It induces stress, and it engenders a loss of confidence. It also denies the recognition of how these folk are engaging and enacting this with great effort, this wider socially held value of being able to practice thrift. And of course, you know, thrift is pretty basic, but if we think then also, and all the pushes to kind of engage with sustainability, we're also seeing that people are really struggling to be able to participate in the sustainability, despite the fact that they are the most vulnerable when we are unsustainable. Socializing is also a key aspect of people's health, which I've already talked about a little bit. Being able to reciprocate, to participate in shared social values are key part of being human. They are as fundamental as human existence is having a healthy body. And of course, so we have a kind of vicious, a pernicious and vicious cycle whereby people who are food insecure are experiencing mental health problems, which in turn feeds into physical health problems and poor diet, which feeds back into their ability to utilize and access food, in the food that they need. So it really is a system that is multi-scaled. So just want to turn back to the Food and You Too survey about food bank use. People are not using, we have all these people who are struggling, but people are not using food banks. So if we look back on how people are saving life, and we hear that some are not. I hear stories about people collapsing on the street. I hear stories about people dying. It's awful. During the pandemic, some people revealed to us that they were eating food out of rubbish bins. Others talk about how their friends and neighbors helped them out, sometimes with food that made them ill. Many talked about the shame and stigma that they felt and how they tried to hide their experiences. We also heard stories of extreme loneliness. What is clear from the Food and You data is that the majority of those who could access a food bank, technically could access a food bank, are not. And this may be because there is nothing available in the area where they live at the times that are available to them. And this is probably part of the answer. But all the qualitative evidence indicates that it is stigma that people feel asking for help, linked to how food emergency support is often, not always, but often configured and framed. So I mentioned already, people don't talk to themselves as being in poverty. They describe themselves as struggling. They talk about stretched resources. They talk about stress, not poverty. They could point to people who struggle more than them. And those are the people somehow who are in poverty. And this is everybody at every level. Even homeless people talk about people who are struggling more. And they also recognize that they're mobilizing all the strategies that they have available to them to make ends meet within the context within which they live their lives. Yet some charity support, not all, let me say again, not all. Yesterday on the radio show, there was this organization called Dad's House, and they clearly are not operating in this vein. But some charity support and certainly government benefits demand that people prove that they are worthy by their lack. So they require referral systems, or they some other way of demonstrating that they do not have time, or do not have enough to live out their lives, to enough money or food or whatever to live out their lives healthily. And this lack is also then cast as a personal failure to budget and provide for one's families, which people internalize. So in my research, what I was really striking or trying to do was to seek out examples of community interventions that identify solutions that prevent stigma, recognize the assets of people that people have and build on them, and catch people before they reach that rock bottom position, before all their resources, and if we think about the food insecurity pillars as buckets of resources, before all those resources are depleted, then the chances of recovery are better and easier. It's much easier to avoid falling off the cliff if you haven't already fallen off the cliff. So these organizations actually really go out of their way to try to reduce the barriers to participation, barriers in terms of stigma, but also barriers in terms of local access and barriers in terms of having to demonstrate that lack or that inability. These interventions are alternative to the traditional charity food bank model, and I'll explain how they vary in just a minute. So in my work, I draw on resilience theory, which recognizes both the vulnerability to crisis and considers how to recover after a shock. And I don't just mean shocks, immediate shocks like we saw with losing a job, or the immediate shocks of having to all of a sudden pay for a repair to your automobile that you depend upon in order to do your work. I'm talking about these it also includes these sort of longer term shocks. Food banks were set up initially to address those short term, very short term shocks. They are not designed, the more traditional approach that limit people's participation to 3, that worries about food bank tourism and so forth. Those approaches are not designed for the current context within which people are living. People are going without and are really struggling for months, not a few days. So my motivation behind developing the food ladders was to make these other approaches visible and visible options to people beyond the standalone food bank. And I wanted also to provide a framework for understanding and evaluating what is available in a particular location, as an approach that communities might engage with. Alongside, food alliances and community organizations. I wanted to be able to elevate what they're doing and then consider how we might enhance resilience or how they might also locate themselves within a wider landscape of food support that is connected up, that provides a network or a safety net that catches people before they fall off the cliff. If you can make a net is much better than a sieve for catching things and holding things. So food ladders interventions mobilize the more than nutrient, calorie, and commercial aspects of food, such as the capacity to bring people together and foster shared understanding and collaboration. It recognizes, embraces this notion that food is not just what you eat, it's also social glue. These interventions create safe and inclusive spaces for experimentation and interaction food, and by that I mean they help reduce that risk of trying new things, of being afraid to engage with foods that you've never had before. They use positive language of empowerment around food. So it's not language like food poverty, but it's language that speaks to those shared social values. We will help you to stretch your budget. We will help you to engage with the sustainable development goals if you come and participate in our activity. It frames food security in ways that are relatable, as for example, using words like stretched and struggling. It builds place-specific levels of support that recognize where people are now and what they might need to move upward. So it's not just about filling a gap, but also thinking, what else do we need to bring into that space to help you to achieve that life that you want to live, to be able to live to an age that is one that's filled with joy and happiness, not living just a bare life. And also they enable the recognition and enhancement of locally based assets to create transformations in those communities, and to actually give people the space to be able to collaborate together, to support each other, to rebuild those foodscapes in which we live. And we can see really fantastic examples of this through community growing projects and allotment activities, but even on a more sort of day-to-day, everyday kind of way. I was speaking to people who use an organization called the Bread and Butter Thing, which is a food club. It's not a food bank. And the people there were telling me during the pandemic that as they'd met people through that food club, one of the things that they'd done is that they created their own private WhatsApp group to check on each other and make sure everyone was okay. So they were self-organizing a community support network that provided advice to each other about what other resources might be available. They were sharing food, but they were also sharing that care that, you know, really suggest a well-connected community, care for others, to make sure that people weren't disappearing and you know, needing help and getting that help for them. Now, I just want to say also times people tend to we kind of tend to go to the individualized approach. And I want to say that actually not all organizations have to do everything. Some do. Some are fantastic hubs. They have all sorts of things. And the examples on the money box discussion yesterday really illustrate that. But you can participate in a network of organizations, each providing different levels of support, but in a connected kind of way. And we certainly see, I apologize for the drill that's going on, we can certainly see that in Sheffield, for example, which is coordinating and building food ladders. All right, I'm going to kind of skip through. I've got some further examples of all of this. I'm going to skip through them because I really want to take your questions, but I'm happy to talk about these kind of things in a little more depth, and also how they go and connect to the Sustainable Development Goals, because they do, and this sort of activity actually reaches well beyond the most obvious Sustainable Development Goals. So I just want to conclude with this slide. One of my friends gave me this slide, or drew this picture for me, and it's actually the food supply chain. But when you connect people together in place, when you recognize and acknowledge how people are interconnected, when you can become friends with your neighbors, when you know each other, and when you know what other organizations across that food chain are doing and what other people are doing, what you end up is with this kind of community or network. And this is where my friend Gary says this is where the alchemy happens. When we move beyond food as profit to embrace the full range of characteristics and unfold that into activities that are not that sort of Victorian charity, it's absolutely amazing what can be achieved. So thank you very much for inviting me today. Thank you for listening. And if you want to learn more, I've got a little slide here with some of my links. I'm happy to share this presentation with you and as a slide deck or as a PDF, and I will go ahead and do that. So in anticipation of the questions, I shall turn off my slide sharing, and I look forward to taking your questions. So how do I stop that?
Megan, that's great. Thank you so much.
All right, brilliant.
It's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it. Well, we have a couple of wee questions, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. So one person would like to know what you mean by cumulative loss of foodways and food knowledge, and particularly what your evidence for this would be.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to get a pen.
You're okay.
Cumulative loss of foodways and food knowledges. So one of the things that we often hear is people saying, well, when my parents were younger, you know, they were during the miners' strikes, for example, when I was younger and I was a kid, we always had enough food because my parents were poor and there was real poverty then. But they always managed because they would go and catch hares, or they would forage and get food that way, or they would preserve their own meats. We went through a period in the 1970s when that wasn't a thing anymore. You know, the push was to go toward a more commercialized food system. We have institutional regulations that kind of prevent us from harvesting and gleaning some activities, which means when people aren't doing things anymore, they stop knowing how to do them. So that's what I mean by the loss of foodways, how we do with food, but also those knowledges of what we do with food. So that's one example. Another example is if you, for example, if you can't afford to buy grapes for your household because, you know, grapes are £5 for a punnet and you've got £20 this week to buy food for everybody, £5 worth of grapes is a real luxury. And when that happens, month on month on month, you don't buy grapes anymore. And when everybody in that place, month on month on month, is foregoing the grapes because they become a luxury. Not only do children stop knowing what grapes are because they've never had them, but they disappear from the foodscape. They disappear from the supermarkets because nobody's buying them, because they can't afford them. So that's what I mean by that loss, that cumulative loss of foodways, how we know what to do with food, how we know what food is, but also that loss of that food from those places.
Perfect. That's great, Megan. Thank you so much. And another question is, you often mention in your talk that we must repair foodscapes, or how we might use scale data when talking with authorities. And this participant would like to know who you mean when you refer to as we.
All of us.
Everyone.
I think this is actually, I think we as a society must do this. So to some extent, it might be, through lobbying, through encouraging, through providing ways to support the reintroduction of, say, fruits and vegetables into a location. So currently I'm working on a project called Fresh Street, which is a voucher scheme. And what we do is we give every household in an area a £5 voucher a week, which they can spend in a local, at a food stall in a local market. So in that market, they can spend these £5 on fruits and vegetables. What we see from that project is, because it's place-based, there aren't the barriers and the stigma attached. Because it's place-based, there's enough people to actually make and sustain the market traders that are located in that place and allow them to offer more. It removes the risk, but it also does things like, it's in Bradford, where one of the places where this project is operating. One of the stall holders got a van and drives the van into what we might think of as a food desert. And he started doing this to enable people to use their vouchers with him without having to travel. But what he sees now is that people on other streets who are not part of the research are now coming to the van to buy fruits and vegetables from him, from his van. So it's creating a market for food in that place. So that's one thing we as a local society, or we as a society, can do, but there are lots of other things. We can individually support our local markets. We can do things that help to encourage and develop. We all have resources that we can bring. So without knowing the context of the person who asked the question, thinking of this as a system means that we're all part of that system. So whether it's through volunteering, whether it's about making different decisions in our daily lives, whether it's about lobbying, whether, there's a whole range of ways that we can intervene and support people to do better, or to have better, to live a better life. So I'll just stop with that, but I'm happy to elaborate a little bit if there's further question to that.
All right, thank you so much, Megan. Another participant would like to thank you for your interest in the presentation. Would also like to know, what could a food safety officer do to help in this situation, and what are some of the possible solutions?
All right, so food safety, I have to admit, I'm not a food safety officer, so you're the expert in this. And so I might turn the question around to you and ask you, given what you've heard, what are the levers that you have for power? What can you do to support in terms of food safety and in terms of supporting people? And it might be, in terms of suggesting to retail places that you're participating, or that you're visiting, if they are, for example, do they have a lot of excess, or is there a way that they might use their surplus to support other organizations within their community who are able to use that food in a way that supports people? So, for example, in Sheffield, there's an organization called FoodWorks, and FoodWorks rescues food that would otherwise become wasted, not because it's out of date or not because it's not safe, but it's food that is no longer commercial. And so there's lots of ways in which that sort of food that can be repurposed and reused to help support people who maybe can't afford to buy it straight up, but can stretch their budgets, but use these other ways of using it to stretch their budgets. Sorry, that's a little bit of a complicated answer, I understand, but I guess my challenge actually is, your job, think about the levers that you have, and how might you move those or push those or suggest, or the connections, you're part of a network of people, how might you use that to help rebuild and support those places where people are living? Is there, can you hook them up with somebody else who might be able to provide some other, can you create that network or help facilitate that network?
All right, thank you so much, Megan. Hope that really helped the participant.
Sorry, probably not the answer they wanted.
You're okay. Another question that came in there is, what are the realized or potential barriers to people who are food insecure accessing the local schemes or opportunities within the food ladders? For example, could a lack of transport or maybe feelings of shame or embarrassment still be a problem?
So I would absolutely say shame is absolutely a problem. And it's not a shame, it's, so there's two things that happen. People are reluctant to go in the first place. One of the biggest predictors of reuse is actually using in the first instance. So people are reluctant to go in the first instance because of this like long-held shame around needing to go and use that food, not being able, that they've individualized or taken into themselves that responsibility, when actually it's the context. In a lot of instances, it's the context that's creating the problems for them in the first instance. So absolutely shame, that initial moment of shame. We also know that there are some food bank experiences. If anybody's watched the film I, Daniel Blake, the food bank, despite how nice the people are who are working in these places and how well-meaning they might be, and they absolutely are, it comes from a place of goodness. There are, in a lot of these places, a really sharp divide between the volunteer and the person coming to get support. And I'm talking about that in the sort of food banks sort of scenario. And that divide is a us or them scenario. And that can be really shaming as well. Whether it's done with with a smile and the most care, it still can be a shaming experience because you are not able to be reciprocal in that context. You're always the recipient, and you've already had to demonstrate that you are unable to cope, that you are a failure. Now, in the middle tier, or that sort of middle tier food ladders activity, people, those organizations tend to really, really blur the boundaries between somebody receiving the support and somebody who is volunteering to give the support. So, for example, there's an organization called the Bread and Butter Thing who actively uses and engages local volunteers who also come and get the food and are part of the food club to act and to help distribute that, break down those barriers. I have a little film called More Than Just Food. There's an organization, one of my favorite ever organizations is called Edlington Community Organization, and they are really a food hub. They are a community organization. They have after and before school club activities. They have afternoon sessions for older people, which include a cup of tea. The before and after school club have hot meals for some kids because the benefits level to qualify for free school meals is very low. So those people just over that, this might be the only hot meal those kids are going to get in that day. But they don't frame it that way. Of course, they frame it as an after school activity. They also have a food bank, so emergency food support, but they also have a pantry scheme, a food club type scheme, which is longer term. It tends to include better food, tends to include fruits and vegetables. And again, the volunteers are part of that scheme, are also participating in it. People who maybe use the food bank are given opportunities to volunteer in the office. So there's always that kind of opportunity to give back and that reciprocal, what assets do you have? How can we incorporate you into our community rather than keep you separate? So I think that's a really important barrier. There are maybe locational barriers, certainly, and transport cost barriers and timing barriers. So, oftentimes food banks are only open sort of for a couple hours in the week, and if you can't get there, or if that's at a time when you're not available, you're not going to be able to access, and you're going to have to go somewhere else. Quite a lot of food banks are very place-based, so they want people who are only in their locality to access their support. Sometimes it's knowledge, so people don't know what's available in their area. I would just say that an awful lot of the pandemic, and certainly, but an awful lot of local authorities now know what's offered in their places, and not just the food bank offer, but other things. So if people are struggling, they can also go to their local authority to find out what's available in their area for them and how they might be able to get involved.
Perfect, thank you, Megan. That's really interesting. Another question that came in there is, could you see the major players in the UK food system, such as larger supermarkets, getting involved with the food ladder schemes, and would this necessarily be a good thing?
So yes, I can see that. And yes, I do think it's a good thing. We're all part of the system. I know there are those, I'm not, I kind of sit in the middle of everything in terms of politics. I'm much more of a pragmatic person. And I know that we've always had hunger. We have always had hunger since the beginning of time. What the supermarket system does is it evens out that time and addresses national scale food security. But for example, larger players really could provide, subsidize and provide better food in those more deprived areas, for example, even if it's not going to make them a profit, because the profits are being made elsewhere. So I think there's a question about values and, there's corporate social responsibility and what are the values that we're pushing. I think also, and this is probably edging toward the political, but I'm going to say it anyway, a lot of the people who are struggling within the food system are within the food system itself. So I guess the question to ask is, are you paying decent wages to those who are working for you? And if not, a living wage is really important, because if you pay people a living wage, they're not quite, they're not in this space. That goes for suppliers as well. And I know there are lots of supermarkets and bigger players who are now moving toward that. So I applaud that, absolutely. And that is absolutely something they can do. I also think that there is a lot that the larger commercial organizations can do to support and help those mid-scale, mid-tier kind of organizations, such as, providing grants and funding, because, they require infrastructure, and doing that mid-tier support requires a little bit more infrastructure than opening up a cupboard in your church hall and just putting ambient food in it. Certainly the redistribution of surplus food and thinking about how you might redistribute more surplus from wherever it comes within the supply chain, and working with those who do that redistribution work, and there are lots of them. It's not, fair share is one, but there are others. How we might move that food on and what are the best models for doing that is something also that they can do. I think there's something about date labels. So there's an issue around, I noticed the other day that one large retailer is removing the date labels from the fruits and vegetables that they have. Fruits and even though it's best before, people don't really understand what best means. They don't understand that it's a stock best quality. I mean, what does that mean, really? They don't get that, if it's not good quality, and of course, when you're expressing love to your family, you want to give them the best that you possibly can. And so, people do that when they go to the shops, they pick out the nicest apples and the rest of it. But certainly, removing those date labels means that at home, the kids aren't chucking the out-of-date lettuce and the out-of-date apples into the bin. And I remember having fights with my children about that, and I've certainly had arguments with my partner about that. Just because that date is on it doesn't mean it's bad. So those kind of arguments, those things are certainly also things they can do. With retailers, there's some issues around own brand labeling, and if you're a retailer, you understand that. That might make it easier for food to be redistributed to a wider array of uses and support. And my list is quite long, so I'll stop there to allow other questions. And I realize we're coming close to the end of time.
Thank you so much, Megan. So about 2 minutes left if you'd have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So another participant said that they think when we identify the problem, it's often to do with a loss of skills or knowledge, etc., around food and budgeting, and the solution becomes more food or budgeting, education and training. Is there a way to acknowledge the systematic drivers of these changes in individual skills and in our solutions?
Absolutely, there is. Absolutely there is. And the last thing, I'm always really careful. There are some people who don't cook or don't know how to cook. And I did a survey with the Bread and Butter Things charity recently on they have about 20,000 members, and we surveyed their members, and one of the questions we asked them is about how confident a cook are you? And about 75% of those who responded said they were confident cooks. About 25% said they weren't very confident cooks. So there is room and space for interventions, but that's the minority, not the majority. So the majority are confident cooks. They know what they're doing. They understand the messages. They're just really unable to engage that. And there are these issues of risk. So finding ways, and again, it can be a case of how you frame it. So you could call this a cooking class for people who don't know how to cook, and nobody's going to rock up to that. Or you can say, we're going to have a community social eating activity where everybody brings something, and we're going to share our recipes. And people will learn from each other. They'll have an opportunity to try, particularly in diverse areas, to try new things. Maybe you'll bring in some other new kind of tastes for people. And because it's low or no cost, people will feel empowered to try that. If you add a bit of music and a few balloons, it becomes a party. And it's not a soup kitchen. You see what I'm saying? So how we configure and organize things will make a huge difference in terms of how people are able to develop and enhance those skills. But I'd also argue we don't blame those people for that situation, and we need more really useful food education in schools. And by that, I mean food education that really speaks to not the commercialization of food. My kids had how to make a fancy cupcake. You know, that's not very useful. It's how do you cook? How do you do things like make corned beef or salted beef, so you don't have to buy it at the supermarket? How do you make meatballs? How can you make food that actually expands and expands the repertoire of what children have available to them, but also gives them an opportunity to taste those things which they may not have exposure to, because that's another way of kind of enhancing and building. So I hope that answered the question.
Perfect, Megan, thank you so much. And I think that's probably us on time now. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Megan Blake, on behalf of the Food for Thought team and everyone at the FSA for such an interesting topic. And I'm sure everyone's learned a lot from it. And I'd like to thank everyone who was able to attend here today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.